Along the coast of southern Mindanao, the water did something water is not supposed to do. It pulled back. It drew away from the shore and exposed wet sand that hadn't felt open air in a generation. And for a few seconds, the world went quiet. Too quiet. Then the earth let go. About 35 miles beneath the floor of the Pacific, a slab of rock slipped. Not gently, all at once. A fault that had been locked for decades, gripping, straining, holding its breath, finally failed. And the energy that tore out of that single rupture measured a magnitude 7.8, enough to throw buildings off their foundations, enough to send seawater climbing 8 feet up the shore at Labac, enough to put a tsunami warning into the hands of 6 different nations in the very same minute. The Philippines, Indonesia, Palau, Taiwan, Papua New Guinea, and the southern islands of Japan. 68 people did not survive what came next. And here is the part that should stay with you. The fault that did this is not rare, it is not exotic. The exact same kind of fault, the exact same trapped, overdue, straining kind of fault, runs directly beneath the western edge of the United States. Right now, tonight. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly what happened off Mindanao, exactly why scientists now believe America's own version would shake harder than we were ever told, and exactly why almost no one is connecting these two stories. That's the part that matters. That's the part nobody's saying out loud. This is the Horizon Lab. Let's get into it. If this is the kind of thing your mind circles back to at night, if you want the real science underneath the headline instead of the panic or the false comfort, subscribe so the next update actually finds you. And do me one favor, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because by the time we reach the end of this, your location is going to matter more than you'd like it to. Now, there's a particular kind of person who hears about an earthquake like this and does not reach for a phone to film it. They reach for the data. For more than 20 years, the scientists who study these subduction zones have been doing the same quiet, unglamorous work, year after year, watching instruments that almost never move, waiting for the single day they finally do. Picture one of them. 2 decades on the same stretch of coastline. 2 decades of measurements that, to anyone else, would look like nothing at all. A few millimeters of strain a year. A coastline rising so slowly you could never feel it. The kind of patient, invisible work that doesn't make the news, until one morning it does. And here is what 20 years on this problem teaches a person, the thing the rest of us would rather not hear. The quiet is not safety. The stillness is not peace. The quiet is the sound of a fault loading. That's the lens we're going to look through for the next hour. Not the conspiracy version, not the doomsday prepper version, the version a veteran scientist actually lives with. Because the truth, as you'll see, turns out to be more unsettling than any conspiracy. So let's go back to that coastline in Mindanao, to the seconds before the water pulled away. Because what happened there in June of 2026 did not come out of nowhere. It was decades in the making. It was, in a very real sense, scheduled. And the same clock that ran out under the Philippines is ticking under Seattle, under Portland, under a stretch of California that hasn't moved in a very, very long time. The question isn't whether you should be afraid. The question is whether you're afraid of the right thing. So here is what the instruments actually recorded. Not the rumors, not the first panicked numbers that always come out wrong in the opening hour. The confirmed data. It struck just after 7:30 in the morning, local time, on the 8th of June, 2026. The epicenter sat offshore from Sarangani province, at the southern tip of Mindanao, and the rupture began about 35 miles down. That depth matters, and we'll come back to why. The magnitude settled, after the seismologists did their work, at 7.8. Now you have to understand how that number gets made, because this is where the truth starts to separate from the noise. When the ground moves, it isn't one country's opinion that decides how big it was. 3 different agencies, on 3 different pieces of the map, were all watching the same wave roll out across the planet. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, the agency they call PHIVOLCS, the people whose entire job is to watch this exact fault. The United States Geological Survey, reading the same shock from instruments on the other side of the Pacific, and Indonesia's agency, BMKG, watching from the south, because Indonesia had every reason to be afraid of what came next. 3 agencies, 1 number. They agreed. A magnitude 7.8. And the moment they agreed, the warnings went out. Think about what that means for a second. A single rupture in a single spot in the ocean was dangerous enough that within minutes, 6 separate nations were told to expect a wall of water. The Philippines, obviously, but also Indonesia, Palau, Taiwan, Papua New Guinea, and the southern islands of Japan, more than 1,000 miles away. 1 fault. 6 countries told to run. The sea answered. The highest wave they later measured in the field climbed 8 feet up the shore at Lebak in Sultan Kudarat. 8 feet of ocean, arriving where there should have been dry land. If you've ever stood on a beach and watched a wave come in at your ankles, picture that same water standing taller than you are and moving with the weight of the entire sea behind it. And the Earth was not finished. In the hours that followed, the same fault zone shuddered 138 more times. Aftershocks. The largest of them a magnitude 6.7. Let me put that in perspective, because it's easy to skip past. A magnitude 6.7 is, on its own, a serious, damaging earthquake, the kind that makes headlines in any normal week. And it was happening over and over, as an afterthought, as the leftover energy of the main event. The ground in Mindanao did not stop moving for a long time. When the dust settled, the human cost was this: 68 people confirmed dead, around 30 still missing, which is a gentle word for a number that almost never improves, roughly 1,400 people injured, and more than 82,000 homes damaged or destroyed. 82,000. That's not a statistic, that's a mid-sized American city, every house in it cracked, leaning, or gone. Now I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the moment where a lot of channels would stop. They'd give you the body count, layer on some dramatic music, and leave you scared and empty. That's not the deal here. The numbers are the beginning of the story, not the end of it. Because a magnitude 7.8 doesn't just happen. It is a specific kind of earthquake, made by a specific kind of fault, doing a specific kind of thing that geologists have a name for. It's called a megathrust, and it is the single most powerful kind of earthquake the planet is capable of producing. It's the kind that made the 2011 disaster in Japan, the kind that made the 2004 catastrophe in the Indian Ocean, and it is, almost exactly, the kind of fault that sits locked and silent off the coast of Oregon and Washington state right now. But numbers protect us. That's the quiet function they serve. 82,000 homes is so large a figure that it stops meaning anything. It becomes a shape on a screen. You can read it, nod, and feel nothing. That's not a flaw in you. That's how the human mind survives news like this. So let's do the opposite. Let's shrink it all the way down to 90 seconds, to 1 family. We don't have every name out of those coastal towns, and I won't pretend a story onto a real person I can't verify, but we know, from the people who lived through it, what those 90 seconds were actually like. So picture it honestly. It's morning, just past 7:30, in a coastal village near the water, in a town not so different from Lebak. The day has already started. Someone is making breakfast. A kid is half-dressed for school. The radio is on. It is the most ordinary morning imaginable, and that is exactly the point. No one gets a warning. There is no build-up. There is no music swelling under the scene to tell you the moment has come. The first jolt feels like a truck hitting the house. You almost ignore it. And then the floor does something a floor is never supposed to do. It moves. Not a shudder, a roll. Like the ground has turned to liquid underneath you, and the table, and the entire house are riding on top of it. You try to stand. You can't. That's the detail survivors come back to, again and again. You think, in an earthquake you'll run. You won't. You'll be on your hands and knees, because standing is no longer a thing your body is allowed to do. The walls are talking now, a deep, grinding groan, and somewhere glass is breaking, and you are screaming a child's name and you cannot hear your own voice over the sound of the earth. 90 seconds. That's roughly how long the worst of it lasts in a great earthquake. Read that sentence. It took you a few seconds. Now imagine it stretched across a minute and a half. Every fraction of it convinced this is the moment the roof comes down. People describe it as the longest 90 seconds of a human life, and they are not exaggerating. They are underselling it. And then it stops. And here is the cruelest part of the whole thing. The stopping is not the safety. Because if you live near that coast, you know what the silence means. You run outside, and you look at the sea, and the sea is wrong. It's pulling back. It's draining away from the shore, exposing sand and rock and stranded boats. And every grandmother in every coastal town in that part of the world has told every child the same thing. When the water leaves like that, you do not go look at it. You run. Uphill. Now. The ones who knew ran. The wave that followed climbed 8 feet up the shore at Labac. 8 feet of ocean where children walk to school. And behind it, for hours, the ground kept shaking. 138 more times, so that even the people who survived the wave spent the rest of that day too afraid to go back inside what was left of their homes. That was one family, one 90-second window, in one town. Now multiply it, by tens of thousands of homes, by 6 nations watching the same warning light up. That is the true scale of a magnitude 7.8, and no statistic on Earth can carry it. But I promised you this wasn't going to be a channel that just makes you feel that and walks away. So here's the turn. Here's the thing our veteran scientist would tell you, sitting across the table, that almost no one says out loud in the first emotional days after a disaster. Every second of what you just imagined was, in principle, foreseeable. Not the exact day, not the exact hour, but the fact of it, the certainty that this fault, this specific stretch of the Earth, was going to do this eventually. That was known. That was, in the cold language of the science, expected. And to understand how something this devastating can also be this predictable, we have to go down, 35 miles down, into the dark, where the real story has been building for 200 years. So come down with me, 35 miles, straight down, beneath the floor of the Pacific. It's dark, it's hot, and it is the most important place in this entire story. Down here, the Earth is not one solid thing. The outer shell of our planet is broken into enormous slabs of rock called tectonic plates, and they are always moving. Not fast, about as fast as your fingernails grow, but they never stop, and off the coast of Mindanao, 2 of these plates meet. One of them, the heavier oceanic plate, is being forced down and underneath the other, slowly, relentlessly, diving back into the planet, inch by inch, century after century. Scientists call this a subduction zone, and it builds the biggest earthquakes our world is capable of. Here's the problem. If those 2 plates could just slide past each other smoothly, none of this would happen. There'd be no earthquake. But they don't slide. They stick. The rock catches. It locks together under unimaginable pressure, and it holds. And this is where our veteran scientist would stop you and reach for something on the desk. A wooden ruler, maybe. A pencil. Anything that bends. Because this is the whole thing, right here. Take that ruler in both hands and start to bend it. It resists. It holds its shape. You push harder, and it bows, storing the force of your hands inside itself, and still it holds. It looks stable. It looks fine, right up until the instant it isn't, and then it snaps. All of that stored energy, all the force you'd been quietly loading into it for the last 30 seconds, releases in a single violent crack that stings your hands. That is a megathrust earthquake. That is exactly what happened off Mindanao. For decades, maybe centuries, those locked plates had been bending, storing strain. The rock was bowing under the pressure of a continent that would not stop pushing, and from the surface, everything looked calm. Boats went out, children grew up, 2 generations lived their whole lives on top of a fault that was loading like a bent ruler the size of a mountain range. And then, just past 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, it reached the limit of what rock can hold. And it snapped back. The 2 plates lurched past each other in a matter of seconds, releasing centuries of stored strain all at once, and the seafloor itself jumped. That sudden jump of the ocean floor is what shoved the sea upward. That is where your 8-foot wave came from, not from the water, from the ground beneath it. Now do you see why the depth mattered? Why I asked you to remember it? The location of that rupture, right at the edge of the trench, where the plates lock, is exactly what made it so dangerous to so many coastlines at once. Shift that same energy a little deeper, a little farther inland, and you get a different disaster. But this one happened in close to the worst possible place for a tsunami. And the science knew that place was loaded. That's the part that keeps a person up at night after 20 years in this field. Not the earthquakes themselves, the waiting. Because here's the brutal limit of what we can do. A scientist can measure the strain. They can watch the coastline bow upward, millimeter by millimeter, on instruments so sensitive they can feel the planet breathe. They can tell you, with real confidence, that a fault is loaded, that it is bent nearly to its limit, that it is, in their words, ready. What they cannot tell you is when, not the year, not the day. They can hand you a fault that is 99% of the way to failure and still not know if it snaps tonight, or in 11 years, or after they're gone. Imagine living with that. Imagine knowing the ruler is bent almost to breaking, holding it in your hands every single day of your career, and never being allowed to know the exact second it lets go. That is the quiet our scientist warned you about. The stillness that isn't peace. It's a fault, loading. And here's the thought that should be forming in the back of your mind right about now. If this is how it works, if this is a machine that runs on patience and pressure and inevitability, then how many other faults around the world are sitting in that same silent, loaded, ready state right now? The answer is going to take us all the way around the Pacific, and then it's going to bring us home. To understand why Mindanao matters to you, sitting where you are right now, you have to zoom out, all the way out, until you're looking down at the entire Pacific Ocean from space. Trace the edge of it with your finger, down the west coast of South America, up through Central America and Mexico, along California, Oregon, Washington, up into Alaska and out across the Aleutian Islands, then down the other side, past Kamchatka, past Japan, past the Philippines, all the way to New Zealand. You've just drawn a horseshoe of fire around the entire ocean. Geologists call it the Ring of Fire, and it is the most violent stretch of real estate on the face of the planet. This is where the subduction happens. This is where the plates dive and lock and load. Roughly 90% of the world's earthquakes happen along this single ring. The overwhelming majority of its active volcanoes sit on it too. Mindanao isn't an exception to the rule. Mindanao is the rule, doing exactly what the Ring of Fire does. And here's what should unsettle you. The year 2026 has been a loud one, a very loud one. Mindanao's magnitude 7.8 in June was not the only great earthquake to tear along this ring this year. Back in April, a magnitude 7.4 struck off the Sanriku coast of Japan, and looming over all of it is Kamchatka, that lonely Russian peninsula at the top of the ring. Because in 2025, Kamchatka was hit by a monster, a magnitude 8.8, one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded by modern instruments. And here is the part almost no one outside the field is talking about. 11 months later, it still hasn't stopped. Just 2 days before I sat down to put this together, on the 19th of June, the seafloor off Kamchatka shuddered again, twice. A magnitude 6.6 and then, within the same minute, a magnitude 6.0, right on its heels. Aftershocks. 11 months after the main event. And this is not a surprise to the people who watch it. When that magnitude 8.8 hit, the United States Geological Survey ran the numbers and told the world there was a 96% chance of a magnitude 6 or larger aftershock in just the first week, and that the region would keep shaking for years. Not days, years. That's the aftermath of a true megathrust. The Earth doesn't slam a door. It rings like a bell, for a very long time. And the ground isn't the only thing moving up there. While the aftershocks roll on, the volcanoes of Kamchatka are awake too. Just this month, the PHIVOLCS volcano threw a plume of ash 6 miles into the sky, drifting hundreds of miles downwind. Right now, as you watch this, parts of that ring are shaking and burning at the same time. So the question almost asks itself, doesn't it? Is the Ring of Fire waking up? Is it all connected? Is something building? And this is exactly where our veteran scientist would put a hand up and slow you down. Because the honest answer matters more than the dramatic one. No, these faults are not signaling each other across the ocean. Mindanao did not set off Kamchatka. The Ring of Fire is not coordinating. It never sleeps, and it never has. What you're watching isn't the ring waking up. It's the ring doing, in a single busy year, what it has always done. Different faults, on different schedules, each one a bent ruler reaching its own private breaking point, all of them just happening to be loud at once. That's the responsible answer, and in a strange way, it's the more frightening one, because it means there's no single switch being flipped, no master event you could watch for, just dozens of independent, loaded, ready faults scattered around the rim of the Pacific, each one counting down on a clock only the rock can read. And now we come to the part of this story I've been walking you toward since the very first sentence, because that horseshoe of fire, that ring that runs past Japan and the Philippines and Kamchatka, you traced it yourself a few minutes ago, and your finger ran right along the coast of the United States. The Ring of Fire doesn't stop at America's shoreline. It runs straight through it, and the most dangerous segment of the entire ring, the one the scientists fear the most, is not in Russia or Japan or the Philippines. It's a few miles off the coast of Oregon, and it has been silent, loading, for more than 300 years. It has a name, the Cascadia subduction zone. If you've never heard of it, you are not alone, and that is part of the problem. It doesn't have the fame of the San Andreas. It doesn't show up in disaster movies, but it is, by a wide margin, the most dangerous fault in the United States. And here's the thing you need to sit with. It is the exact same kind of fault that just devastated Mindanao. The same machine. A slab of ocean floor, called the Juan de Fuca Plate, diving down beneath the North American continent, locking, bending, loading. It runs for about 700 miles. It starts up off the coast of British Columbia, comes down past Vancouver Island, runs the full length of Washington State, the full length of Oregon, and down into Northern California, offshore, just out of sight. The whole time you're driving the Pacific coast, looking at that beautiful water, it's out there, a few dozen miles off the beach, silent. Now, when did it last rupture? When did this 700-mile monster last snap back like a bent ruler the way Mindanao's fault did? January of the year 1700, 326 years ago. We'll come back to that night, because the story of how we even know that date is one of the most extraordinary pieces of scientific detective work you will ever hear. But hold the number for now. 326 years of silence, and you already know what silence means. We spent the first half of this together learning it. Silence is not safety. The quiet is the loading. For 3 centuries, that fault has been doing exactly what Mindanao's fault was doing for its decades. Sticking, bending, storing the strain of a continent that will not stop pushing west. It is bent, right now, and it is getting closer to its limit every single day. This is the fault our veteran scientist has spent a career staring at. Picture 20 years of it. 20 years of instruments planted along the Oregon coast, measuring a coastline that is quietly bowing upward, being squeezed and lifted by the locked plate beneath it. 20 years of data that tells the same story over and over, in numbers too small to feel. It's loaded. It's loaded. It's still loaded. And it's getting more loaded all the time. Imagine being the person who knows that, who can read it right off the screen, and then driving home through Portland at rush hour, past the schools, past the bridges, past 2 million people who have no idea they're living on top of a bent ruler. Because here is the scale of it, and I need you to really hear this part. Mindanao was a magnitude 7.8. Cascadia, when it goes, is expected to be a magnitude 8 to 9, and the earthquake scale is a liar. It looks like a 9 is just a little bigger than a 7.8. It is not. The scale is built so that every single step up is about 32 times more energy released. So a magnitude 9 doesn't release a bit more energy than the quake that killed dozens and leveled 80,000 homes in the Philippines. It releases something like 60 times more. 60. That is not a bigger version of Mindanao. That is a different category of event entirely. And it is aimed at Seattle, at Portland, at Tacoma, Olympia, Eugene. At the coastal towns of Oregon and Washington, where the American wave, would arrive in some places in as little as 15 to 20 minutes. Not the hours that some coastlines get. Minutes. This is the part where the story stops being about a faraway place on the news. The footage you saw out of Mindanao, the sea pulling back, the homes in pieces, the families running uphill, that is not a foreign disaster. That is a rehearsal. That is a preview, on a smaller fault, of what the science says is coming to the American Northwest. Not if, when. This is your ground too, and I wish that were the end of the bad news. I wish I could tell you that's the worst of it. That at least we understand the threat completely. That at least the numbers are settled. They're not. Because in 2026, brand new research came out about Cascadia. Research that took the threat scientists already feared and made it measurably worse. And almost nobody covered it. For decades, the people who study Cascadia have been building maps, not road maps, shaking maps, computer models that try to answer one question. When this fault finally goes, how hard will the ground move under each city, under Seattle, under Portland, under every coastal town in between? Those maps are the foundation of everything. They decide how strong a hospital has to be built, how a bridge gets designed, how much steel goes into a school. The entire defense of the Pacific Northwest rests on getting those numbers right. And in 2026, a team of scientists at the United States Geological Survey, led by a researcher named Erin Worth, stood up at the annual meeting of the Seismological Society of America and reported something that should have been front-page news everywhere. The maps were wrong, and they were wrong in the worst possible direction. Here's what they found. That diving slab of ocean floor, the Juan de Fuca Plate, the one locked beneath northern Oregon, it turns out it sits about 3 miles shallower than the models had assumed, around 12 miles down, instead of the deeper figure everyone had been building on for years. 3 miles. It sounds like a small correction, a rounding error. It is not. Let me tell you why, with something simple. Imagine someone is going to punch a wall as hard as they can. Now, does it matter whether they start with their fist 2 feet back or 2 inches back? Of course it does. The closer the source of the force is to the thing it hits, the more violent the blow. An earthquake works the same way. The shaking that wrecks a city comes from the rupture below it. And if that rupture is 3 miles closer to the surface than we thought, then the punch lands harder. Closer source, harder hit. How much harder? The team put a number on it. The peak ground acceleration, which is just the scientific way of saying how hard and how fast the ground jerks underneath you, could be 9 to 17% higher than the official estimates. Across the populated valleys of the Northwest, 9 to 17% more violent than the number the buildings were designed to survive. Now sit with what that means through the eyes of our veteran scientist. You've spent 20 years building these models, 20 years telling engineers, here, build to this. This is how hard it will shake. And those engineers did. They poured the foundations, they sized the steel, they built the hospitals and the overpasses, and the apartment towers to meet a number. And then, 2 decades into your career, the ground itself tells you the number was too low, that the margin of safety you thought a whole region had, a slice of it was never really there. That's not a comfortable discovery. That's the kind of finding that changes what you can sleep through. Because it doesn't just mean the next earthquake will be strong. We already knew that. It means a layer of the protection people are counting on, the protection they don't even know they're counting on as they drive to work, was quietly built on a number that reality just revised upward. And here's the part that fits the pattern of this entire story. Almost nobody covered it. A magnitude 7.8 across the world gets a few days of headlines and then it's gone. A scientific finding that the most dangerous fault in America is more dangerous than we thought? That made it into the journals, into a conference room, and almost nowhere else. The disaster gets the cameras, the warning gets silence. This is the difference between fear and understanding. The fear is easy. Anyone can tell you the big one is coming. What almost no one will tell you is that in 2026, the science quietly got worse, that the slab is closer than we believed, that the ground will hit harder than the maps promised. That's not doom for the sake of doom. That's the real thing, the verified thing, the thing the experts are actually worried about, while the rest of the world looks away. So let me ask you something. We keep saying Cascadia will produce a magnitude 8 to 9. We keep saying the shaking will be worse than we thought. But how do we actually know any of this? How can scientists speak with such confidence about a fault that no living human has ever seen rupture? The answer is a story, a true one. It begins on a winter night in the year 1700, and it ends with a wave that crossed an entire ocean to leave its signature in the records of a country that didn't even feel the quake. Picture the coast of the Pacific Northwest on a winter night in the year 1700. There are no cities, no written records on this side of the ocean, just old-growth forest running down to the water, and the people who had lived there for thousands of years, asleep in their villages along the shore. It was, as best we can reconstruct it, around 9 o'clock at night on the 26th of January, when the fault let go. The whole 700 miles of it, or close to it, in one rupture, a magnitude 9. The ground shook, by the accounts passed down, for something like 5 minutes. Not 90 seconds, like Mindanao, 5 minutes. And then the coastline itself dropped. Whole stretches of forest and marsh sank several feet in moments, and the sea came rushing in to fill the space. And out across the dark Pacific, a wave began to travel. Now here's the question that should be nagging at you. If there were no written records on the American coast, no instruments, no one taking notes, how on earth do scientists know the date? Not the century, not the decade, the exact night. The 26th of January 1700, around 9 in the evening. How is that even possible? This is the part our veteran scientist tells with something close to reverence, because it is one of the great detective stories in all of science. It started with dead trees. Along the estuaries of Washington and Oregon, there are stands of western red cedar that have been dead for centuries, grey skeletons standing in the salt marsh. The locals called them ghost forests. And someone finally asked the right question. What killed them? When you study the rings of those dead trees and match them against living wood, you find something chilling. Every one of them stopped growing at the same time. Their last full ring was the year 1699. They died in the winter that followed. Something dropped that coastline into the salt water and killed an entire forest, all at once, in the winter of 1699 to 1700. But trees can only narrow it to a season. The exact night came from the other side of the ocean. In Japan, in the villages along the Pacific coast, there are written records going back centuries, careful ones. And in those records, on a night that lines up with late January of 1700, there is an account of something the villagers could not explain. The sea rose. A tsunami came in, flooded homes, damaged the rice, swept away buildings. But here is the impossible part. No one had felt an earthquake. There was no shaking, no warning, just a wave arriving out of a calm night from nowhere. The Japanese have a name for it now. They call it the orphan tsunami, a wave with no parent, a wave whose earthquake was never felt because the earthquake happened on the other side of the entire Pacific Ocean 10 hours earlier off the coast of America. And when modern scientists took those precise Japanese records, the date, the time of night the water rose, and ran the wave backward across the ocean, the math pointed straight at Cascadia. The size of the wave told them the size of the quake, a magnitude 9, and the timing, back calculated across 5,000 miles of ocean, gave them the night, the 26th of January, 1700. And then, the final confirmation, the one that should give you chills. The oral histories of the native peoples of that coast, passed down through the generations, tell of exactly this. A night the ground shook so hard people couldn't stand. A village on the water that was simply gone by morning. Stories of the ground and the sea at war. They had been telling the truth for 300 years. The science just finally caught up to them. Think about what our scientist is really telling you here. We are not guessing about Cascadia. We are not theorizing. We have the date of the last one. We have the magnitude. We have a forest of dead trees, a wave recorded in a foreign country, and the memory of the people who survived it, all pointing to the same night. This fault has done it before. We know exactly how, and the clock that started ticking that night in 1700 has now been running for 326 years. But Cascadia is not the only American fault sitting at its limit, because while the Northwest waits on a 300-year clock, there's another fault, far to the south, that's been winding tight for 1,000. Leave the Northwest for a moment and come south, to California, to the one fault in America that actually is famous, the San Andreas. Now, the San Andreas is a different animal from Cascadia, and our scientist would want you to get this right, because the difference matters. Cascadia is a subduction zone, one plate diving under another. The San Andreas isn't diving, it's sliding. It's the boundary where two plates grind past each other sideways, the Pacific plate scraping northwest against the North American plate, inch by inch, year after year, different motion. But, and here's the part that ties it all together, the exact same problem. The plates don't slide smoothly, they lock, they catch, and they store strain, just like a bent ruler, until the rock can't hold it anymore. So the only real question is the same one we've been asking this whole time. How loaded is it? How close to the limit? In June of 2026, just days before I put this together, a team of scientists published the answer in a journal called the Journal of Geophysical Research, and the answer is about as bad as it gets. They studied the southern San Andreas and a sister fault called the San Jacinto, right where they come together at a place called Cajon Pass, just north of San Bernardino, and they found that the stress on that section of fault is now at its highest level in 1,000 years. Not in decades, not in a lifetime, 1,000 years. The rock there is more tightly wound right now than it has been since before the Crusades. And then they found something else. Something with a name that should make the hair stand up on your arms. They call it an earthquake gate. Here's what that means. Where two faults meet, like the San Andreas and the San Jacinto at Cajon Pass, there's a kind of structural junction, and a junction like that can do one of two things when a rupture comes racing toward it. It can act like a wall and stop the earthquake dead, or it can act like a gate and swing open and let the rupture pass straight through, jumping from one fault onto the other. Do you see why that's the nightmare? Because if that gate stays shut, you get one fault's earthquake. Bad, but survivable. But if the gate opens, the rupture doesn't stop. It tears across the junction and keeps going, linking two separate faults into a single, monstrous, combined rupture. You don't get one earthquake, you get both, fused into one, ripping south toward the most populated region in the American West. And this new research suggests that gate, at Cajon Pass, with the fault wound tighter than it's been in 1,000 years, is exactly the kind that can open. When did the southern San Andreas last have its great earthquake? Around the year 1680. More than 300 years ago, on a fault whose history says it shouldn't go anywhere near that long between big ones. It is, by every honest measure, overdue. So step back and look at what our veteran scientist is actually holding now. 2 clocks. In the north, Cascadia, 326 years into its silence, with shaking estimates that just got revised upward. In the south, the San Andreas, wound to a 1,000-year stress peak, with a gate that could open and double the disaster. Two of the most dangerous faults on the continent, on opposite ends of the west coast, both sitting in that same loaded, ready, bent ruler state at the very same time. That is not a prediction. Nobody is telling you the date. Remember the brutal limit from earlier. We can read the loading. We cannot read the timing. But the loading is real. It's measured. It's published. And on both faults at once, it is at or near the worst it has been in centuries. And this is the moment where the abstract has to become concrete. Because a fault at a 1,000-year stress high, an earthquake gate that might swing open, a slab that's closer than we thought, none of that means anything until you ask the only question that actually matters to you, in your home, in your city. What happens to America on the day one of these finally lets go? That's not a comfortable place to go, but you came this far for the truth, so let's go there. Start with the first few minutes. When Cascadia goes, the shaking doesn't last 90 seconds the way it did in Mindanao. A magnitude 9 on a 700-mile fault shakes for 4, maybe 5 minutes. Close your eyes and count that out sometime. 4 minutes of the ground moving. Long enough that older brick buildings come down. Long enough that soft ground beneath parts of Seattle and Portland behaves like liquid, a process called liquefaction, where solid soil turns to something closer to wet sand and whatever was built on top of it sinks, tilts, or falls. But here is the thing our scientist would want you to understand, the thing that separates a bad day from a regional catastrophe. It is not the shaking that defines the months afterward. It's the lifelines. A modern American city runs on invisible threads. Water comes from somewhere far away through pipes and aqueducts. Power comes down lines from distant plants. Fuel arrives through pipelines and along a handful of highways. Food, medicine, everything moves across bridges. You never think about a single one of these threads because they have never once failed you all at the same time. An earthquake on one of these faults cuts them all at once. And nowhere is that clearer than a place we already talked about, Cajon Pass. Remember it? That junction north of San Bernardino, where the San Andreas sits at a 1,000-year stress high. Look at what crosses the fault at exactly that spot. The interstate that feeds Los Angeles, the rail lines, the aqueducts that carry a huge share of Southern California's water, the natural gas lines, the fuel pipelines, the major power lines. They all thread through that same narrow pass, and they all cross the same fault. One rupture there doesn't just shake Los Angeles. It severs the water, the power, the fuel, and the road in the same instant. There is no backup pass. There is no second set of aqueducts. The threads were all run through the same needle. The Northwest has its own version. A huge share of Oregon's liquid fuel sits in a strip of tank farms along the Willamette River in Portland, built decades ago on exactly the kind of soft soil that liquefies. The very fuel that emergency crews would need to respond is sitting in the one place most likely to fail. And out on the coast, there's the wave. 15-20 minutes after the shaking stops, in some towns less. No time to drive. For a lot of those communities, survival isn't an evacuation plan. It's a vertical one. Get to high ground on foot, now, or don't. What do the official numbers look like? For the southern San Andreas, the United States Geological Survey built a detailed scenario they call the shakeout, a magnitude 7.8. Their estimate: around 1,800 dead, around 50,000 injured, roughly $200 billion in damage, hundreds of fires burning at once, with the water mains broken so the hydrants run dry. And that's the fault to the south. For Cascadia, a FEMA official once described the aftermath in the zone nearest the coast in 3 plain words that have haunted planners ever since. Everything, he said, west of Interstate 5, will be toast. This is why the experts who actually know the science do not sleep easy. Not because they're dramatic people, because they've run the models. They've drawn the maps, including the ones that just got worse in 2026. They know what 4 minutes of shaking does to a city that was built, in part, to a number that turned out to be too low. They know what happens when every lifeline crosses the same fault. This isn't doom invented to scare you. These are the contingency plans of your own government, written by people who took the science seriously. And that, right there, is the hardest part of this whole story to hold in your head. Because it's real, it's coming, and no one can tell you when. And when something is that frightening and that uncertain, the human mind does something predictable. It goes looking for a story that feels more controllable, a villain, a secret, a switch somebody could flip, or unflip, if only we made them. That's where the conspiracy theories come in, the weather machines, the secret predictions the government is supposedly hiding, the idea that someone, somewhere is doing this on purpose. And I want to take those seriously, every one of them, and walk through exactly why they fall apart. Because the truth underneath them is so much more unsettling than the lie. Because the truth is, no one is in control of this at all. So let's take them seriously, one at a time. Because every one of these theories exists for an understandable reason, and our scientist has heard all of them, for 20 years, usually shouted across a comment section. Start with the big one, the idea that a research facility up in Alaska, or some secret machine like it, is triggering these earthquakes, maybe controlling the weather too. And the answer to this is not an opinion, it's arithmetic. That facility is a radio antenna array. It studies the upper atmosphere with radio waves. Now think back to where these earthquakes actually happen. 35 miles down, through solid rock. A radio wave aimed at the sky doesn't reach 35 miles into the earth any more than a flashlight pointed at the ceiling lights up your basement. But the real killer is the energy. A magnitude 9 earthquake releases more energy in a few minutes than every power plant on the planet produces in months. There is no transmitter, no machine, nothing humanity has ever built that comes within a millionth of that. We cannot make this. We could not stop it if we tried. The numbers simply do not allow it. Next, the theory that scientists can secretly predict the exact day, and the government is hiding it. And here's the strange thing. Our scientists would almost laugh at this one, then go quiet, because they wish it were true. Remember the brutal limit we hit way back at the beginning? We can read the loading, we cannot read the timing. If anyone on Earth could actually predict the day a fault ruptures, they would not hide it. They would win every prize science has to offer. And more to the point, look at what scientists actually do. They publish the warnings. They stand up at conferences and tell the world Cascadia is overdue and the shaking will be worse than we thought. That's not the behavior of people suppressing the truth. That's the behavior of people screaming it into a void where almost no one is listening. Now, here's where I have to be honest with you, because responsible means responsible even when it's inconvenient. Can humans cause earthquakes at all? Yes. A little. It's real, and it has a name. Induced seismicity. When companies inject wastewater deep underground, in places like Oklahoma, it can lubricate small faults and set off quakes. Real ones. Up to around a magnitude 5. That part is true, and the science is solid. But follow the logic. A magnitude 5 from human activity is a world away from a magnitude 9 megathrust. You cannot frack your way to the big one. You cannot inject enough water to load a 700-mile subduction zone that's been storing the force of a moving continent for 3 centuries. The small ones, sometimes yes. The monster, never. That energy comes from the planet itself. And the last one, earthquake weather. The feeling that a certain hot, still, heavy day is when the ground decides to move. There's something almost sweet about this one, because people have believed it for thousands of years. But the fault is 35 miles down. The weather is a thin skin of air at the surface. A change in air pressure on a hot afternoon is nothing, less than nothing, against the stress of plates grinding past each other. Scientists have looked, carefully. There's a tiny, measurable tug from the tides and the seasons on some faults. A real but almost laughably small effect. It cannot make a great earthquake. The sky above you does not control the rock beneath you. So why do we reach for these stories? Our scientist has a theory, and it's the most human thing in this entire video. We reach for them because they offer the one thing the truth refuses to give us. Control. If a machine is doing it, someone could be made to stop. If the government can predict it, someone knows. If it's the weather, at least there's a pattern. Every conspiracy hands you a villain, and a villain means somebody is at the wheel. But there is no villain. That's the whole terrible secret. There is no machine, no hidden schedule, no one to blame, and no one to beg. There is only the slow, blind, indifferent grinding of the plates, loading faults under your cities on a timetable that answers to nothing and no one. The conspiracy says somebody is in control. The truth is that nobody is. And once you really understand that, the only question left is the one that actually matters. Not who's doing this, but what, knowing all of it, you're going to do. So let's bring it all the way back. One fault, off the coast of the Philippines, slipped on a June morning and took 68 lives, leveled 80,000 homes, and sent 6 nations running for high ground. And the only thing that made it a foreign story, instead of an American one, is geography. The same kind of fault, the same locked, bent, loaded machine sits off Oregon and Washington, silent for 326 years. And another, to the south, is wound tighter than it's been in 1,000. 2 clocks, both running, neither one readable. Now, remember what I asked you at the very beginning. I asked you to tell me where you're watching from. And I told you that by the end, that location would matter more than you'd like. Here's why. If you're watching from Seattle, from Portland, from anywhere along the Oregon or Washington coast, from Los Angeles or the Inland Empire, then this was never a video about a distant disaster. This was a video about your ground. The fault doesn't care about the comment section. It only cares about strain, and under your feet, the strain is real. But I promised you, all the way back at the start, that this would not be a channel that just frightens you and leaves. So here is the turn. Here is what 20 years on this problem actually teaches a person, and it is not despair. You cannot control when. We've said it over and over, because it's the truth. But you can control whether the wave finds you ready or finds you asleep. And that, it turns out, is the only real control anyone was ever looking for in those conspiracy theories. It was here the whole time. It just doesn't look like a secret machine. It looks like water. Two weeks of it, stored in your home, because the lifelines will be down for far longer than the 72 hours people used to plan for. Food that doesn't need a refrigerator. The heavy furniture in your house bolted to the wall, so it can't become the thing that hurts you in those first violent seconds. And if you live near that coast, the single most important piece of knowledge you can own. Are you in the tsunami zone? And if you are, where is your high ground? And can you get there on foot, fast, the moment the shaking stops, without waiting for a single official to tell you to go? Drop, cover, and hold on when it hits, and then move. That's not paranoia. That's the same respect for the ground that the people of that Mindanao coast were taught by their grandmothers. When the water leaves, you run. They've always known. Now you do too. This is the strange peace our veteran scientist has made with it. After 2 decades of watching instruments that almost never move, they've stopped being afraid of the earthquake itself. What they fear is a region that knows it's coming and chooses to look away. Because the science has done its job. It found the ghost forests. It read the orphan tsunami. It measured the slab and revised the maps and published every warning. The knowing is finished. The only thing left undone is the listening. And here is the part I can't tie up neatly for you, because the earth refuses to let me. This story does not have an ending yet. As you watch this, those faults are still loading. The coastline off Oregon is still bowing upward by a few millimeters a year. The rock at Cajon Pass is still winding tighter. Nothing about this stopped for the length of a video. The clock that started ticking on a winter night in 1700 is still ticking right now, in this exact second, and no one alive can tell you how many seconds are left on it. So this isn't a conclusion. It's a status report on a story still being written under your feet. The sea pulled back off Mindanao in June. It will pull back somewhere else, someday, on a morning no one can name. The only question that has ever mattered is whether, when it does, we were paying attention. Stay ready, stay curious, and stay subscribed, because the ground keeps talking, and we're going to keep listening, together. I'll see you in the next one.